On the night of June 3, 1989, crowds gathered on Tiananmen Square in the center of Beijing. Among them was Yan Jiaqi, then director of the Political Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences.
Later, I realized at that moment shots had already been fired, but the hundreds of thousands of people at Tiananmen Square didn't see what was coming at them.
Armed troops and military vehicles advanced toward the protesters on Tiananmen Square from different directions outside the city. Those in the square had no idea what was approaching them. And around midnight, Yan returned home.
As I fell asleep around 1 or 2 a.m., I suddenly heard loud gunshots that sounded just like firecrackers, but the sound was much louder and sharper. We ran toward the balcony to take a look. Our balcony was on the east side of the alley where you could see East Chang'an Street. We saw a lot of flashes and tense ones. At that time, I knew they had opened fire, and I thought China had really changed.
That evening, along dimly lit streets, journalist Wang Juntao watched soldiers fire relentlessly on the crowd.
People attacked a few vehicles with bricks, marching forward, screaming, 1, 2, 3. They stood together. Those bricks struck like raindrops, and as the bricks were thrown, the soldiers continued to fire.
Wang, who spoke recently at a forum in a Washington suburb along with other Tiananmen survivors, said some memories are still vivid 30 years later.
I saw for the first time a human die with eyes still wide open. His face was looking up at the sky, and his head was streaming down with blood. My head felt numb. It occurred to me that day was going to remain as a solemn day in China's history. China's politics was taking a huge step backwards.
On the night of June 3rd, when Peking University student Wang Dan heard that troops had opened fire, his initial reaction was disbelief.
From payphones on Chang'an Street, students called each other to spread the news that the government troops had opened fire at protesters. When the calls first came in, I still didn't believe what was said. But later, as calls increased, I realized it must be true. For 2 or 3 days, I had absolutely no thoughts because, your brain turns numb with big shocks.
Looking back at Tiananmen, Xiao, who is now living in exile in the U.S., says the fallout from Tiananmen among China's leaders shaped the country's politics in the years that followed. A small faction of hardliners took power, he said, and have kept it, handing it off to their children who are known as princelings.
The current political and economic systems were formed as princelings came to power. All of China's assets are in the hands of 200 families, which has led to their economic development at the total cost of the environment.
Yan Jiaqi says the government's inability to own up to what happened that night continues to hold the country back.
What happened on June 4th, 1989 needs to be corrected to all of China as a massacre, an act of crime on the people executed by the Communist Party. China as a country will never move forward if the truth about June 4th, 1989 is not told. Without justice, China will have no future.
Talk of Tiananmen remains heavily censored in China, where the bloody crackdown is still referred to by the government as a counter-revolutionary riot. For Xiao and Hailun, this is Anna Kook, VOA News, Washington.